The chandeliers blazed above silk gowns and jeweled smiles when the prince, bored and arrogant, stopped the music with a single gesture. His mocking eyes fell not on a lady of rank, but on the maid in her plain dress, tray trembling in her hands, her face burning beneath the laughter of nobles. With cruel delight, he called her to the center of the ballroom and sneered, "If you dance this waltz, I'll marry you," words meant only to amuse the crowd. Humiliation thickened the air, yet in her silence there was a flicker of defiance, a quiet strength no one expected. And as the first note rose, the hall was about to witness not ridicule, but a revelation that would turn mockery into awe. Before we begin this beautiful period romance story, tell me in the comments where you're listening from. I love knowing where you're joining me from. The chandeliers burned like small suns above the polished floor, each crystal trembling when the door admitted another draft of winter air. Heat shimmered off candles and bodies. Perfume mingled with beeswax. The musicians at their gallery breathed as one, bows resting, waiting for the signal to begin the next waltz. Servants moved in narrow currents along the walls, silver trays kept level, as if by virtue, not training. She kept to the currents. She knew their invisible borders, the line between conversation and silence, between the idle wave of a ringed hand and the rebuke behind a raised fan. She wore plain shoes with thin soles that let her feel the grain of the floor beneath the polish. The house had been burnished all afternoon for this display. Her hands smelled faintly of lemon and soap, her sleeves clean but mended twice. The livery fit well because she had made it fit, not because anyone measured her. She passed a cluster of gentlemen with powdered throats and careful smiles, their laughter pitched to carry. One called for more wine without looking. She anticipated the reach of his hand and left the glass where he would find it, an inch from tipping. He would never know how close he had come to a stain on his embroidered waistcoat. That was the work, to keep disaster invisible. Tonight the family gave their largest ball of the season. Guests arrived earlier than usual, the ladies intent on being seen, the gentlemen intent on not appearing eager. Flowers clung to every banister, lilies whitening in the heat, roses leaning toward their reflections in the mirrored panels along the walls. Candlelight softened faces and sharpened jewels. The chatter sloped around the room in tides. She could feel it in her skin. When the footmen by the main doors straightened themselves, she knew without looking. A ripple passed through the room. Fans made a soft, synchronized rustle. The talk turned bright for a moment, and then subsided under a different kind of attention. She turned, because everyone turned. He entered with the kind of grace that came from never needing to hurry. The prince had a way of filling a doorway without pausing in it. His coat was cut to an inch of austerity, his cravat pinned with a small pearl. Not the gaudy kind of gem that begged for notice. He carried notice with him whether he chose to or not. The hosts bowed. The ladies dipped. The gentlemen nodded too often. The prince's expression suggested that all this pleased him in the way a familiar painting pleases, a thing to be glanced at and moved past. She watched as others watched, careful to keep her face angled slightly down. He had a smile made for rooms like this, generous enough to flatter, remote enough to remain untouched. When he laughed, people straightened, as if they had guessed the right answer. He accepted the right hands, he made the right remarks. He drifted through compliment and greeting like a ship through a well-mapped harbor. Her tray grew heavy. She shifted it and slipped sideways to avoid the hem of a gown that was all froth and patience. On the far side of the room a candle guttered, and a footman reached up with a taper to steady it. But his sleeve passed too close, and the flame leaned away, relit itself, and stood again. Even the candle knew how to behave under watch. The musician struck a few tuning notes. Above her, the violinist flexed his fingers and shook his wrist. The flautist swabbed his instrument with a strip of linen. The drum, barely more than a heartbeat in this hall, waited under a musician's palm. The set would begin again when someone important wanted it. Near the head of the room, the prince accepted the host's welcome and let himself be drawn toward the center. He had the air of a man who assumed the floor was always his, and the assumption made it mostly true. She watched the people watching him and wondered briefly what it was to be looked at as a fact and not as a function. Then a guest touched the rim of her tray, and she moved again, slipping between chairs, careful with a glass whose base left a clean, wet ring on polished wood. Even from 3 steps back and to the left, her place, always a fraction removed, she could feel the mood shift. The bowl had been bright and content. Now it sharpened, seeking an edge. The room had been fed with wine and music. It was hungry for something to talk about tomorrow. She reached the wall again and set her tray on a side table to trade it for another stacked with sweet pastries. Sugar clung under her nails. The pastry felt weightless on the tongue when she had tasted the scraps in the kitchen earlier, and then the baker had sent her away with a flick of his towel, as if her hunger meant she would run the kitchen empty. She had not looked back. She never gave anyone that satisfaction. Across the floor, a lady's laugh rose too high, then broke into a cough that she disguised with her fan. Someone murmured in sympathy. The host's daughter adjusted her glove with care that suggested her hand might be shaking. None of this belonged to her, and yet the room passed through her senses the way light passed through glass, seen and not seen. She caught herself staring, and the habit of her life returned. Eyes down, chin level, shoulders set. A footman brushed past, and she felt the brief press of his sleeve against her own. His face said nothing. His nod was almost invisible. They were practiced at not existing. In the gallery, the first violin looked toward the floor. A nod traveled like a signal through the players. The bow rose. The first notes of the next waltz would follow the prince's desire. She waited for the sound. He delayed it. He took a step, and then another, away from the circle of those ready to claim his attention. He moved as if he were bored, which meant that boredom would be indulged. He tilted his head, spoke a word to a gentleman who bent too close to hear a better joke than was offered, and smiled as if he had been entertained. He was not. The smile did not reach his eyes. He thought of other rooms like this one, other nights when the same polished floor reflected the same hungry faces. The genre of admiration rarely changed. He marveled sometimes that he could be so exhaustingly necessary to the happiness of people he did not know. He marked the host's efforts, the floral profusion, the air folded over with warmth, the band that had been hired from town at some expense because they could play more modern pieces without falling into a country muddle. He knew quality without needing to comment on it. He had learned early that pointing at a thing diminished it. The waltz was new enough to be interesting. It made people uneasy in a way that thrilled them. The hand placed at a waist, the turns that asked for trust. He could make that unease into fun with very little effort. It was the sort of thing expected of him. To disappoint expectation was work. He was not inclined to work tonight. He let his gaze pass the room and return with intention. The ladies were splendid, each a composition of silk, posture, and practiced glance. Some had the modesty of perfect self-possession. Some had the hunger of those who wanted a triumph and would seize one if it came close enough. He did not stop there. Along the edge of the floor, where the mirror swallowed the bodies and returned them as a wider room, he saw a servant standing with a tray of pastries. She did not fidget. Her position was precisely chosen between a chair that might lurch backward and a gentleman's careless, broad stance. Her hair had escaped a little, a strand drawn loose by heat and motion. It clung to her temple in a fine, damp curve. She steadied her tray with her left hand and placed a pastry on a plate with her right. Her fingers were quick and neat. He would have looked away. He would have called someone's name and offered the kind of gallant remark that ended an evening with nothing to remember. He considered the choice the way a man considers a card game he expects to win. One of the gentlemen near him muttered something about how the evening needed liveliness. Another laughed in obedient agreement. A lady nearby said she feared fainting from pleasure and needed the refreshment of surprise. He smiled as if they had been witty. They had not. But their idea had married his boredom. He felt the small relief that comes when a tedious play offers a moment of unscripted nonsense. If he gave them something to laugh at, They would love him for it tomorrow, as they loved him today. The expectation would be met, and he could sleep. He looked back to the servant. The mirror caught him looking, and multiplied the act. It gave him back a figure unbothered, a prince indulging his taste for amusement. The thought formed itself, almost without his participation. He lifted his chin slightly. "Bring her forward," he said, not loudly, but with the sort of tone that created hands to obey it. A footman moved as if he had guessed the command before it was spoken. The footman turned toward the edge of the floor and motioned with his hand, gentler than the order deserved. The servant with the pastries looked up, surprised, and searched for the reason an ordinary motion had been broken in half. The footman came to her and said her name, or perhaps only said you, because names were not needed tonight. Her eyes widened for a fraction of a second, and then steadied. The prince did not look away now. He did not need to. The conversation around him acquired a brighter tone. People understood that something was about to happen and arranged their faces in anticipation. He allowed the smile to return, fuller this time, acknowledging his own role in their happiness. He turned, and as he did, the musicians paused, bows lifted but unmoving, waiting upon a new cue. The servant, no, the maid, stood at the room's perimeter, caught by every glance as if by a hook. The tray in her hands seemed suddenly absurd in the center of so much attention. She placed it on the nearest table with care that veiled a tremor. A puff of sugar rose and fell. The scent of cinnamon added itself to the heat. She took one step, and then another, her shoes silent on the polished floor. The space between her and the center opened like a book too clean to have been read. The hosts' mouths made polite shapes that did not settle into words. She did not look at them. She looked at the floor, as you look at the sea, when you think you are to be thrown into it. Her throat felt tight for a breath, and then opened again, because breath had to come. The sound in the room had changed. Laughter had been held back by curiosity. The week's gossip had appeared and asked to be served. She could feel the eyes like the pressure of warm water, everywhere and nowhere. She held herself straight. The training of her days returned. Do what you must. Leave no trace. Meet the moment and do not let it see you afraid. Her hands folded one over the other because they needed something to do. She stopped 2 paces from the prince because that was a respectful distance. She lifted her gaze to his chin, not his eyes, because that was the safe thing. He let the moment breathe. It made the room lean forward by a fraction. He looked at her in the way he looked at most things that were not people of his rank, with interest and humor standing balanced. He had not planned a speech. He did not need one. The remark at the center of the room had already been made in the minds of half the guests. He would simply give them the pleasure of hearing it in his voice. "What a clever evening," he said, to no one in particular, and everyone at once. "It would be a shame if we allowed it to grow dull." He let the laughter rise because it would encourage the room to be generous in their delight. He wished only to be entertained. She heard the laughter and felt its temperature. It was warm, and it bit. The prince turned his head slightly, as if acknowledging a quip offered by a gentleman at his elbow. There had not been one. It gave him a reason to smile so that what came next would be less sharp. He looked back at the maid. He did not ask her name. Names complicated simple pleasures. "You," he said. The word had no malice in it, and yet it pressed. "This is a waltz." Her lips parted, but no sound came. The way the word "you" landed on her made her feel counted and discounted at once. She kept her shoulders steady. She thought for a breath that he would ask her to fetch something, more wine or a handkerchief someone had let fall. It would have made sense of the summons. He did not. He took a breath and let the room hold it with him. "If you dance this waltz," he said, his voice clear, the tone amused enough to keep anyone from alarm, "I'll marry you." Silence came, stunned and soft, and then cracked open. Laughter spilled through the room. It did not stop at the edges of the floor. It bounced off the mirrors and the pillars and came back for more. A lady raised her fan to hide a smile too wide. A gentleman choked on his wine, swallowed it with a practiced swallow, and laughed again. The musicians did not play. They sat with their bows held, arms poised, eyes going from the prince to the hosts and back. The leader coughed lightly and looked down, as if the notes might tell him what was safe. She heard the words once, and then they echoed as if the walls had spoken them back. "If you dance this waltz, I'll marry you." She did not look at him. She looked at the hand he had extended, because he had extended it, and that was part of the shock. And she felt the air move over her skin where her hand might meet his. She did not lift her own. The laughter pressed. Humor made a soft cage. She could feel its wires curve into a shape around her. If she refused, the cage would close and stay shut. If she agreed, it might swing wide and then snap shut again. She did not know. A voice near the back of the room said it was clever. Another voice agreed. Someone said it was harmless. Someone said it was daring. Words like harmless and daring had never been applied to her life. Her life was careful. Her life avoided edges. He waited, patient, because patience would be seen as magnanimity, impatient because he wanted the release of laughter. His hand stayed extended. He did not care whom he married. The joke required only that the idea of it be delicious. He smiled, as a man smiles at a horse that is nearly trained. She breathed again. The breath went deeper than any she had taken since the summons. She stood where the light was strongest and felt the heat of candles soften the slight chill that had crept into her fingers. She could say no. It would be proper. It would be safe. It would mark her as a servant who knew her place. She would go back to the wall and trays and quiet and be the object of laughter until dawn. She did not want to be the object of laughter. The thought lit in her like a match. It did not blaze. It burned with a small, unarguable flame. She lifted her chin. She did not look up far. The movement was small, and it changed everything inside her. She looked at his extended hand. She saw the line of his wrist, the steady fingers, the gesture as stylized as any in a dance manual. This was a game he was sure he had already won. She could see the expectation in the room. Flustered refusal or stumbling spectacle. Either would please them. There were things she knew because she had been taught them quietly, without permission, years ago when being taught such things had seemed like preparing for a life other than this one. She had folded those things away because they were trouble. Trouble did not feed you. It made you hungry. She thought of nothing else. She thought of the floor and the space and the knowledge in her body that belonged to her and to no one else. She took a step closer. It made a sound like nothing. It made a sound only she could hear. "Does she even know the steps?" someone said softly, thrilled with the idea of cruelty as a new flavor of sweetness. He turned just enough to show the room that he had heard and was tolerating their help, generous prince that he was. He returned his gaze to her, as if the comment had not been made. He became, for a moment, a man waiting for the laugh he had planned to arrive at his cue. He knew how to wait. He did not know that waiting had made her stronger. Her hand lifted, not much, the smallest of movements toward his. It did not reach his yet. He would have to wait one heartbeat longer. The hosts shifted in a way that looked like approval and felt like fear. Their daughter stared, her cheeks too pink for the hour. The mirror reported 100 faces to the room. The candle that had guttered earlier burned perfectly steady now, as if it had chosen a side. "Let us not be unkind," said a gentleman, and then laughed because unkindness was the point. She heard none of it now. Sound blurred at the edges and sharpened at the center. She saw the floor, the pattern of the wood, the clearance between chairs, the space she would need to turn without grazing a skirt or a knee. She saw the distance to the musicians' gallery and knew that if they began to play, the beat would travel down the banister and under her feet before the notes reached her ears. She brought her hand forward the last inch. Her fingers met his. His hand was warm, Subtle callus ran across the base of his fingers, the sign of a man who wrote more than he wrote. He curled his hand, not fully, as if he were making an offering and a claim at once. He did not grip. He would not need to. He could lead without force. The room sighed. It was a sound like a tide that had realized it could come in farther, and retreated only long enough to make the next wave grander. She could feel a tremor in herself. She steadied it by setting her shoulders. He saw the tremor. He could not miss it, and because he believed it meant fear in the way he understood fear, he relaxed. He inclined his head as if he had been granted a gift he deserved. "Good," he said, but only with his eyes. "Of course." The musicians waited, strings hovering. The leader glanced at the prince and raised his bow a fraction. He did not nod yet. He had one more gesture to make. He set his hand lightly at her waist where the dance demanded it. The contact was formal and not formal at all. His hand did not press. It rested, the way a command rests in a room until someone picks it up. The warmth of his palm through the thin fabric made her breath misstep once and then recover. She set her other hand at his shoulder, precisely where a dancing master would have placed it, and the small part of her that had learned all those years ago took over tasks that her mind had not yet named. He looked down at her at last, not at her chin, not at his own hand, at her face. Her eyes were not pleading. They were not defiant. They were calm in a way that startled him, and the surprise dropped like a pebble through the clean water of his boredom. He did not have time to feel where it landed. "Play," he said, and the word was shaped to the musicians, though he did not raise his voice. The leader dipped his bow and brought it down. Every candle leaned, infinitesimally, as if listening for what would come next. Then the hall held its breath as the first chord lifted, and she drew her weight into the ball of her foot, almost imperceptible, to take the first step. The first chord breathed into her bones and she stepped, not forward but into turn, letting the measure carry her weight from heel to ball to toe. The hall expanded and contracted with that movement. The prince's hand at her waist was a point of heat around which the world arranged itself. She matched his first lead with a consent so precise it felt like refusal and acceptance at once. The turn drew the light along her sleeve. The chandeliers swam. The mirrors multiplied the circle until it seemed there were 100 pairs beginning the same impossibility. She felt the old memory of counting, 1, 2, 3, not as a lesson, but as pulse. The air was sweet with wax and lilies. Heat lay on her shoulders like a shawl. She did not think of the promise dressed as a jest. She thought of space, the clear yard between them, the safe arc of her skirt, the distance to the nearest heel, the drift of a chair 2 paces off her right. She met the first curve of the waltz with a control that kept the smallest tremor from her fingers. His shoulder under her hand was firm, the cloth smooth. He led with the easy assurance of a man who expects to be followed. She allowed him leadership and quietly chose the line of it. Her step did not challenge. It clarified. A half-breath later, he understood enough to adjust. The turn deepened. The polished floor took them into its gloss and gave them back taller. A whisper leaked out near the wall, muffled behind a fan. Another pearl of laughter followed, the kind that expects the fun to continue. She heard none of the words. Sound came to her as texture, not meaning. The bow stroked a clean, sweet note. The drummer's hand gave a heartbeat that she could ride from turn to turn. The violins found the curve of the melody and held it aloft. He inclined his head, almost imperceptibly, to mark a corner of the phrase. She answered by easing into the next step a fraction sooner than he expected. The adjustment showed in his hand and in the angle of his shoulders. He was quick. He had to be. The dance did not allow hesitation without cost. Her calm was not bravado. It was the only way to keep breath in a room that fed on embarrassment. She turned and caught sight of herself in the long mirror. A dark dress cut for service, a plain face lifted, a line of neck without ornament. The image was not a joke. It was an answer. Beyond the glass, the noble's colors, wine, cream, watered blue, blended and broke into a restless sea. She did not flinch. He drew her through a tighter turn. The hem of her skirt whisked past his boot and did not touch it. A lady near the edge of the floor shifted back, her chair legs making a soft protest. The maid traced the line that would keep them clear and felt her body know the spacing before her mind could arrange the names of the shapes. Steady, he murmured, the word low enough to belong only to them. Always, she said, not to flatter but to steady herself with the sound. His hand warmed where it rested. The fabric at her side remembered that heat after the contact shifted with the rise and fall of the dance. She met it without coyness. She met it without fear. The truth of it was simple. If she failed, she would be meat for a week's talk. If she succeeded, she would be meat for a week's talk. The difference would live only in herself. She chose the second. Their circle widened. A gentleman near the head of the room turned in his chair to see better. He expected to grin. His expression bent into something else. He whispered to his neighbor. The neighbor forgot to answer. Her breath fell into time with the phrasing. The bow lightened, as if the leader had felt in his shoulder the shift in the air below. The flautist took a grace note he had not planned, and it did not falter. The rails of the gallery hummed against the floor post with each measure. She rode the hum. "Do you know what they want?" he said, dry, after a clean turn that set them square to the long windows. "They want to be pleased," she said, eyes steady. "They will take it as they can." It was not impudence. It was simply correct. He breathed a small, surprised sound that could have been a laugh if he had given it room. He did not. He was discovering that the room was his and was not. It was watching him and watching her and did not know how to divide itself. They crossed the long axis of the floor. The scent of roses strengthened and then dropped away in the wake of their movement. A few ladies on that side did not pretend to hide their interest. One leaned forward, her fan still, her mouth parted only a little. Another kept her fan moving with a precision that meant she was counting something: mistakes, audacity, outcomes. The maid released a breath at the turn and let the room slide behind her like a tide turning on polished stones. The measure lifted again. She matched the rise. She let him feel that she would not require rescue. Pride had served him so often that he might not know what it was to be equal in motion. It was not her duty to teach him. It was her decision to be true to what she knew. "Have you done this before?" he said quietly, and there was curiosity in it, not command. "In other rooms," she said, with no one to laugh. A swallow rippled visibly through the nearest cluster of gentlemen, the kind of swallow men make when the wine goes down wrong because they have forgotten to attend to their throats. One coughed into his fist, another laughed to cover it and stopped when no one joined him. He had expected a stumble by now. He had prepared the proper smile for kindness. He had kept a phrase ready for his own amusement, something about sport and magnanimity. Those phrases fell apart in his hands and lay there as pieces. He did not have the wish to gather them. Her step was not cleverness for its own sake. It was economy and grace. When she turned, she did not snatch at air. She shaped it. When she moved backward, she kept her balance under his arm without seeming to depend on it. When they reached the threat of a crowded corner, she made the smallest shift to bring them safe without making the avoidance look like retreat. He had led many dances, and he had rarely been led within his own leading. The discovery had a bite he did not resent. Their pace increased a shade. The band felt what the floor would bear and offered it. A murmur rose from the edges and tilted into silence that held sound at its edges, like froth around a stone. The room had passed curiosity and was approaching that second, sharper attention that either turns to cruelty or to respect. It would be decided by what came next. The maid did not look at the deciding. She attended to her step. She let memory be a thread, not a net. There had been stolen practice, small, secret, not for show, years ago when she had learned what shape her body could make without shame. She called up none of the faces and all of the muscle. The waltz did not belong to them. It belonged to the beat, to the breath, to the floor she trusted, and the space she could read. They passed the mirror again. In it, she saw his face more clearly than she had dared look. Amusement had folded into concentration and something she understood by its heat and did not name. He felt the mirror on him too. He turned his head a fraction to look at her directly, and for the first time, saw her without the frame of his intention. She did not flinch from his gaze. She did not seek it either. She held it for a heartbeat and returned to the turn. A chair scraped at the far wall. The noise clipped the air. He flicked his attention and marked it, drawing her through a safer line. She knew the chair's teeth by sound and eased her step accordingly. Their competence matched for one clean beat. The match steadied him in a way he could not have anticipated. In a quiet place between phrases, he breathed, "You make this look simple." "It is not," she said. "Then how do you do it?" "By treating it as it deserves." It was not flirtation. It was an ethic. He took it as if it had been offered to him for use and not for ornament. The dance entered a passage where the melody stretched and then contracted like a living thing. Their footwork needed to be clean. He gave the signal with his thumb against her side, the gentlest pressure, and she answered before he finished the thought. Micro-hooks flickered through the crowd. A ladies' fan stilled and then snapped open. A gentleman forgot to sip his wine. A gloved hand lowered inch by inch, its owner unaware that it drifted into her lap. Even the hosts shifted and then stilled, a reed finding the middle of the stream. The music, gladdened by the sense that it had an audience listening for something other than the next jest, grew. He had begun this to feed their hunger and his boredom. He found neither satisfied. Something else had entered the exchange. It did not feel like danger. It felt like truth, and truth in a room built for performance could be dangerous only because people were not used to it. "Are you afraid?" he asked, almost curious. "Yes," she said. "And yet." "And yet." He almost laughed then, not at her but at himself, because the only answer to that was to keep turning. He did. The hall's temperature changed by a degree that was not in the air. The flame on the nearest candle steadied. The wax drooped and glistened, a soft white color thickening. A flake of ash detached from a wick and drifted toward the floor. It would leave no mark. She did not take her eyes from the space where her next step would be. He allowed himself one glance at the listeners. Some of the faces were skeptically amused, ready to spring on the first error. Some had softened into attention that acknowledged skill even if it resented the source. A pair of younger men near the door wore the look of conspirators who had been given more than they expected and did not yet know how to spend it. Her shoulder brushed his sleeve on a turn tighter than the last. The contact was accidental, inevitable, and charged. He adjusted his hand by a fraction. His breath lifted and fell in a rhythm that matched hers without either of them consciously seeking it. For a few measures, the world narrowed to the length of a bow and the width of their circle. "Almost," he said under the music, not as warning but as invitation. She understood and risked a route that would bring them past the densest part of the crowd with a flourish and no collision. She took him through it. A lady's silk flared and then fell flat. A man's knee receded by instinct. They did not break the flow. They did not apologize. A small sound escaped from somewhere between the hosts, a sound that held relief and worry. The prince did not hear it. The maid did. She placed it with all the other sounds and let it drift away. Then came the moment the dance had been moving toward, the final phrase lifting its head to look down at the floor it had just crossed. The leader in the gallery raised his chin. His bow rounded the line. The drummer pressed finger to the drumhead for that whisper of emphasis that would carry the dancers into the last turn with grace. He drew breath to offer her the closing and saw that she had already taken it. He followed with the ease of a man conceding to a better idea. The turn resolved. The measure came home, her skirt still and level, his hand firm, and then withdrawing without clutching. The last note hung in the air like a thin coin balanced on its edge, refusing to fall. Silence cut in. It was complete for the space between one heartbeat and the next. In that space, her hand trembled and then steadied. The hall did not know how to fill the silence. The first response would decide the story they told themselves about what they had seen, a jest adorning itself as talent, or talent revealing itself beneath a jest. His mouth opened, not to laugh, not to rescue, but to say something plain. He did not speak in time. A voice, female and clear and sharpened to carry, slipped into the quiet and split it with the ease of a blade going where it has been before. The words rang above the polished floor and under the painted ceiling. A circus act, not a lady. The room jolted as if struck, and the sound of obedience, laughter, relieved and cruel, rose, collided with startled hush, and climbed higher until the hall shook with it. Laughter rolled over the polished floor and hit the mirrors, ricocheting back as if the room itself approved. It had that dangerous quality of relief after surprise. People were glad to be told what to feel. A few clapped, not in praise, but to push the sound along. Fans clicked open. Chairs moved, small offended coughs disguised as rearrangements. He stood square to the hall with his hand just leaving her waist and felt the heat of what he had stirred. The words that had cut the silence still hung in the air like smoke. He watched the smoke and saw that it did not disperse. It wound itself into shapes. He knew those shapes. They had teeth. He did what he always did when a room threatened to think for itself. He smiled as if he had orchestrated the entire arc from jest to astonishment to giddy insult. He lifted his hands a fraction, offering the crowd its permission. An evening for stories, he said, letting the cheerfulness run easy. You will make free use of this one, I see. There were laughs at that. Grateful, eager, the sound of people returning to a path with hedges on both sides. He angled his head toward the gallery without looking away from the floor. The leader read the sign and drew his bow as if the decision had been his. The band struck a bright, brisk strain, a tune that asked couples to restore the ordinary arrangement of bodies and allowed the crowd to pretend this was the shape things had always meant to take. He turned to the maid with a bow measured to avoid ridicule without granting equality. The measure failed. Nothing he offered could match what the room had seen. He felt it in the way the silence pooled between them, held at the surface only by decorum's thin film. Thank you, he said quietly, the words so private they might not have been spoken. Her lips parted and closed. She inclined her head as a servant receives a dismissal. It was correct. It cost something to give. He saw the cost and wished, for a flash, to give a different coin. The thought startled him. Hands reached for him. The hosts presented genial concern stamped with relief. A gentleman slid in with a compliment that trembled at the edge of mockery and decided to settle. A lady nearest the offender laughed again, louder, as if to prove she had intended to be cruel and had succeeded. He answered them all with ease that felt to him like a coat worn in summer. From the corner of his eye he saw the maid step back. The crowd, obeying its old instinct, removed her from its center with the same efficiency with which it had thrust her there. She passed a man who leaned too close and said something without moving his lips much. Her chin did not alter its angle. She slipped to the table where she had left the tray, lifted it, and let it be a shield that announced her return to the role she could inhabit without punishment. "Most diverting," someone said at his shoulder. "You tame even the dullest night." "Tamed things tend to bite when provoked," he answered, smiling. He meant the room. He felt it. The smile did not entirely reach his voice. The man laughed, grateful to be included in something that sounded like wit. The hosts attempted to tame the moment, too. The lady of the house rose and praised the band in tones that asked for volume. The music obliged. Couples took the floor. Silk moved like water. Gentlemen bowed to women they had no intention of marrying. Laces were adjusted. Gloves were smoothed. The apparatus of the ball clanked back into motion and tried to be graceful about it. He played his part. He allowed a lady to make a remark about insolence and discipline without needing to answer. He responded to a man's aside about servants knowing their place with a bland look that meant anything. He caught a glint of satisfaction in the eye of the one who had made the cutting comment, and let his gaze slide away before it could be thought of as rebuke. There would be time for rebuke later, or there would not. The calculation bored him. He had other numbers in his head now, the ones that counted breath and steps, and the distance between outrage and awe. "Shall we?" a woman said, offering him a hand that had never been refused. He bowed to her and did not take it. "You must forgive me," he said light. "Host's demands. I am commandeered." He turned without waiting to learn whom that explanation would please, and excused himself from the circle with the practiced look of a man summoned by obligations that outranked delight. It was plausible enough. It allowed the room to continue without him. As he moved toward the edge of the floor, a pair of younger men intercepted him long enough to spill admiration mixed with scandal. He indulged them with one raised brow and slipped on. Near the doors, a member of his own circle came close and breathed, well managed, like a prayer and a warning. "Leave it," he said softly. "People will talk." They would have done so in any case. Not like this. He did not slow. Like exactly this. The man fell back, understanding the conversation was finished. The prince passed the pillars, and the gilt cornices gave way to narrower corridors where heat collected, and the hum of the ballroom sank to a persistent throb. Footmen stood at intervals like chessmen in the middle of a game no one would admit to playing. They bowed when they should. They looked through him while seeing everything. He knew those looks. He had grown up among them. He told himself he was circling for air. He told himself he was due to examine the other rooms as courtesy demanded. He told himself he would, at some point in that circuit, forget the heat of a hand, where a hand should never have been allowed to rest, and the steadiness of eyes that had not asked him for rescue. He told himself many things. He turned by habit toward the side passage that led to the long windows that faced the gardens. The air changed there. The scent of lilies thinned. The cold tenderness of night had slipped through a gap and touched the stone. A servant had propped a door a hand's breadth to bring relief to the corridor. He felt the draft on his throat and let it wash his face. Silence made a different kind of noise away from the hall. It collected around corners, and when it was disturbed, it drifted in visible eddies. He heard from the far end the light tap of a shoe and the faint ring of porcelain against silver. She had come here because this was where women sent from the hall asked for water, and where glasses were replenished by hands that did not need to be seen doing it. She had come here because the room next to the garden door held a small table with a cloth over it, and a ewer that sweated with honest cold. She had come here because she had stood before 100 eyes and held still, and now her hands needed a place to shake, and then remember not to. The tray she carried was empty. Her palms stuck slightly to the rim where the metal was clean. She set it on the table and steadied it when it sang. The song was barely a sound. It seemed loud because this place had less noise to hide it. A rush of cold air lifted the loose hair at her temple. She closed her eyes for the space of one breath and let the cold be permission. When she opened them, he was there. He had not come with purpose, she thought, and then saw that he had. He moved as if walking into the corridor had not surprised him. He moved as if he had expected the draft, and the way it would carry the scent of damp earth and a line of green through heat and sugar. His coat caught the dim light and made it into a quiet sheen. She realized, belatedly, that she had not lowered her head. She did not do it abruptly. She let her chin find its place because motion is observed here more than posture. He had already seen too much. She would not give him the satisfaction of thinking she was learning her place again because he had walked into a less crowded room. He stopped short of the distance where conversation becomes conversation. He stood in the distance where a remark can be dropped and recovered without consequence. It was a kinder distance than she had expected. He had not come, then, to be seen speaking. He had come, perhaps, to speak and not be seen. "Cooler here," he said, as if the night had arranged itself to please him. "It is," she said, voice level. "You did not stumble. I was careful. That is not the word I would use. What word would you use?" He did not answer at once. He did not step closer. He looked at the door, the inch of night between wood and jamb, as if answers might slip through that gap with the air. "True," he said at last. Silence followed, not heavy, not light. He watched the tray to avoid watching her. He turned a glove in his hands without putting it on. The glove was soft and black. He made the leather describe a slow circle with his thumb on the seam. She watched the glove, because if she watched his face, her pulse would tell on her. The glove told her enough. He did not wring it. He kept it smooth even when his hands wanted something to do. "You should not have been brought to the floor," he said, a confession and a denial sewn together. "I was summoned." "I know." "You did it." "Yes." The word sat between them like a glass that had cracked down the middle and was somehow still holding water. "I would take it back," he said, and then he did not lie. "Not all of it." She did not smile. The idea of smiling felt like stepping onto a stair that was not there. "You would take back the jest." "Yes." "And which part would you keep?" He looked at her then, properly, in the dim light that made honesty easier. He did not have language for the part he would keep. He went looking for it and returned with a shape that would serve. "The turn," he said quietly. She breathed in. Air sharpened at the back of her throat. The band's distant rhythm slid under the floor. The corridor lifted it and carried it like a river under stone. "Words will be said," he added, practical because he had been taught to be. "They will tire of them. It is the nature of words here. They will not tire if they are fed. Then we will not feed them." "We?" She let the word ask all its questions. He almost laughed. "You are precise. Precision keeps a floor from becoming a hazard. And a life? The same." He stepped closer and then stopped, not because she drew back, but because he found the right distance, as if he had been shown it. He lowered his voice in the way of a man accustomed to making privacy inside public air. "I did not intend—" He paused. Intention felt like a country he should not enter without a guide. "I intended only to give them what they wanted. I did not think beyond that." "I did." Her answer was not a rebuke, though it entered him like one. It was a statement made by someone who had no choice, ever, but to think beyond a moment. He felt the difference between their lives press its seal on the conversation. It cooled his skin. "Will you be dismissed?" he asked, not sure if he had the right to ask, asking anyway. "I do not know." He heard what she did not say. That dismissal would be a wound. That work was not only work but shelter from hunger and the stories people told when they had time to invent cruelty. He had never been hungry in that way. He had been hungry for honesty and for air, and that hunger felt foolish to confess in a corridor that smelled of night and duty. "I will speak," he said. It was the instinct of a man used to speaking and hearing the world shift. It came out too quickly. She made a small motion with her hand, a tilt of palm that both thanked and refused. It may do worse than silence. He absorbed it. He thought of the rooms where his word lit lamps and dimmed them. He thought of the rooms where his word was a torch that caught things he had not meant to set on fire. He closed his mouth on the next promise. "I have offended you," he said instead. "You have made me visible," she said. "That is not always a gift." "I know." The music rippled in the bones of the house. A figure in livery passed the far end of the corridor and glanced once, swiftly, and went on. The glance was enough to send information into the house with the swiftness of a rumor. He felt time shorten around them. He wanted more of it, and could not take it. "Then what can I do that is not harm?" he asked, small for a man like him, and true. "Do not laugh," she said. "Not at me." He let the glove go still. "I have already laughed." Then stop. A breath left him that might have been a promise if he had been the sort of man who believed in simple redemption. He was not. He was better at debts than faith. A footman approached, steps careful, gaze low. He stopped at the distance from which a summons could be given without offense. "Your Highness." The title entered the corridor like cold water, restoring all the borders. "You are wanted." He did not ask by whom. He looked at the maid and then away, because looking again would say too much in a house that listened. "I am wanted," he said, to the footman and to himself. "So I am." He slipped the glove onto one hand with the care of a man who needs a task. He did not say goodbye. The word felt too thin to span the length between what had happened and what must happen now. He inclined his head and moved away. The draught followed him until the door swallowed it. She remained by the small table with the empty tray. She did not reach for the ewer. Her hands had steadied. The room felt both narrower and cleaner. She was not relieved. She was not undone. She was suspended. Silence returned in a new shape. It had an edge to it, a bright edge like a knife that had just been drawn across cloth to test it. She knew the feeling. She had felt it when bread was scarce, and a landlady's patience was thinner than the walls. Something would break this silence. It would be better if she chose. She lifted the tray. The metal was cool where it had not been warmed by her hands. She turned to go. He saw the exchange. He had not gone far. He had left enough distance to be seen by those who needed to see him depart, and had curved back along a second passage where the lamps were fewer. Habit led him there. Unease held him. He did not like the idea that a thing could be begun by him and finished by the room without his consent. He stepped into the darker angle by a pillar and waited for breath to decide his next motion. Motion arrived from another direction. A man detached himself from the far end of the corridor with the grace of someone used to slipping through rooms and arriving where he was least expected and most prepared. He wore the correct expression for the night. A smile you would call agreeable until you noticed it never touched his eyes. He belonged to the loose circle around the prince that tightened when opportunity appeared. He had an ear for what pleased power. He had a nose for where trouble might be turned into leverage. He had watched the dance with a scholar's attention. He had watched the aftermath with a butcher's. Now he watched the maid. He did not address her by name because he did not need it. He addressed her by category, and by the precise courtesy that tells a servant the speaker is convinced of his own kindness. "You must be thirsty," he said, as if observing the weather. "I have work," she said, ready to go around him. He shifted so that going around would be rudeness. He did not touch her. He would never stoop to that. He let the shadow of the pillar arrange itself near his shoulder, making him taller without making him blunt. He lowered his voice, and the courtesy became a sheath. "A word," he said. "Only a word. For your sake." She set the tray down again, because the sound of it trembling would gratify him. She did not give him that. The tray made no sound. Her face arranged itself into the attentive neutrality that lets superiors believe they are being heard. "The evening has been lively," he went on, a preface to cruelty couched as conversation. Liveliness demands a price. Those who do not understand the arithmetic are often surprised to find themselves in arrears. "I have no arithmetic," she said, which was true and not, and he heard only the part that served him. "Then allow me to calculate. You have attracted attention that does not belong to you. You have been allowed to keep your place because our hosts are generous and because the person at the center of the room found your performance charming." The word lodged like a stone under a foot. She did not show that she had felt it. "Charming things," he said, smiling, "are often set down when something newer arrives. One must be careful not to mistake a hand's use of an object for affection for what it holds." She looked at him. "You have said, careful. If that is your advice, I am grateful. I will be careful." He inclined his head as if he had been offered a sweet cake and would decline it. Care is not sufficient when men are provoked to talk. Talk is a contagion. It requires a subject. Better to remove the subject. I cannot remove myself from my duties. Perhaps they can be removed from you. The air seemed to settle around the words more heavily. The draft from the door cooled the sweat at the base of her throat. I have done no wrong, she said. His smile widened in sympathy, perfected by repetition. Wrong and usefulness are cousins in households like this. One can be declared the other when convenience requires it. She let silence do the work a lesser woman would give to please. He did not fill it with mercy. You stand near the prince, he observed, as if reporting on flora in a garden. That proximity makes men competitive with their stories. Imagine how swiftly those stories multiply when someone whispers a better one. Imagine how swiftly a house chooses peace over justice when given the chance. He leaned the slightest bit, enough to bring his voice nearer her ear, enough to make her wish to step back and not do it. Do you know what men will pay for? He asked. A simple tale they can tell without checking the color of their own souls against it. I am offering you a protection against that expense. What protection? Silence, distance, a return to invisibility, and a small arrangement that will ensure your past does not become theater. Her throat tightened. My past is work. Your past is a story, he said softly. Middling people like stories best when they are cruel to someone else. And he allowed himself the smallest of satisfied breaths. I'm very good at finding the parts that travel fastest. She felt the world draw into the width of the corridor and the depth of 2 breaths. The draft lifted a loose curl against her cheek and set it down again as if to say, remember, you are here now. He looked at that curl with calculation, as if it confirmed something he had only suspected. I would be more careful, she said, the phrase quiet, a warning that did not pretend to be a threat. He laughed once, gently. No, that is what you will be. He straightened, smoothing his coat with a palm in an unconscious gesture that betrayed the pleasure he took in the line of his own body. He tilted his head toward the door the prince had used and let his smile cool. It would be unfortunate if the little facts you have hidden found their way into rooms that do not forgive. Do not let misjudgment make you brave. Her hands were empty. She had the urge to pick up the tray simply to keep them from being part of the scene. She did not move. He watched her stillness as if it were music, and he had composed it. You will go back to your work, he said. You will stay to the walls. You will decline any further summons. And you will thank fortune that this night, which could have made you visible in a way you cannot survive, will be permitted to fade. And if I do not? Then I speak, he said, his voice so courteous she could have mistaken it for kindness. And when I speak, the past comes with me. What past? The words escaped before she could stop them. She despised that they sounded like fear. They were fear. He let the question live between them long enough to show that it could breathe on its own. The one you hoped this house would cover, he said. The one that will fit a tale men want to tell too well to be denied. He bowed with an elegance that made mockery look like charity, and stepped aside to let her pass, an act that felt less like deference than like the movement of a gate after it has closed. She did not move. You understand, he said gently. She understood, and the word felt like a lock sliding into place. He smiled as if she had thanked him. She stood with the draft lifting the loose hair at her temple and the weight of unshed breath in her chest, and felt the old, dangerous knowledge return, that silence can be taken for consent when you cannot afford to contradict it. She did not move at first. The corridor held the draft like a breath waiting to be let out, and the words the man had left behind clung to her skin as if they had been spoken closer than they had. Her hands had nothing in them. That felt dangerous. She reached for the tray because the weight steadied her, metal against palm, cool and familiar. She took one step and then another until her feet remembered the old economy of service. The door to the ballroom stood open by a fraction. Music ran out from it and spread thin along the floor. Laughter hung in the air, less sharp than before, but eager to regain shape. She fixed her eyes on the line where wood met stone and walked toward it, counting the beats of the waltz because counting kept thought from breaking apart. She had learned early that fear was useful only to the extent that it told you where not to step. The rest was noise. The man had said, "Past." The word had opened a trap door in her belly and left it open, but her present demanded attention, candles, faces, trays, steps that must carry her without catching a heel or brushing a gown. She lifted her chin the smallest degree required to see, without seeming to see, and entered the heat again. He had not gone far. The corridor swallowed and returned sound in ways that deceived people who did not know its habits. He had heard a voice that was not his, and hers answer low, and he had stopped as if the stone itself had asked him for pause. He did not know why he obeyed. He told himself it was prudence. He told himself it was curiosity. He listened and heard past and speak and rooms that do not forgive. And the air moved over his skin as if a door had been opened inside him to a place not often visited. He did not hear her question. He did not hear the man's threat in full. He heard only enough to give shape to a half-thought. He placed that half-thought against what he knew of the night, his jest, her steadiness, the room's hunger, and saw a picture that was both worse and less exact than the truth. He stayed where the pillar cut the lamplight across his coat and waited until the vibration of the voices ceased. When she stepped back into the ballroom, he let his breath go slowly so that his face would be ready to be seen again. He could not walk in from the dark like a man who had been skulking. He adjusted his glove and moved, unhurried, back through the door with a courtesy that would read as attentiveness rather than retreat. She passed under the chandeliers again and took up her route along the wall. The band had shifted from waltz to something sprightlier to wash the room clean. The hosts had called for a fresh set of glasses. That was good. It gave her a reason to move without appearing to avoid anyone. A lady's fan brushed her arm as she slid behind a chair, an accidental touch that wore the costume of punishment. "Mind," the lady said lightly to her companion. "They climb when you feed them sugar." The companion laughed too quickly. Sugar dust drifted from a pastry and caught on the lady's glove, which she flicked with a delicate impatience. The maid kept the tray steady and stepped past. At the edge of the floor, a gentleman turned too quickly and nearly backed into her. He checked himself at the last, muttered as if scolding a table, and turned away before she could apologize for a collision that had not occurred. Her throat tightened and then let go. She set a filled glass at an empty spot on a sideboard and saw her hand tremble. She placed her other hand over it and pressed until the tremor smoothed. He saw the tremor from across the room. He saw the gentleman half turn, saw the lady's fan angle like a small blade, saw the way conversation bent to allow cruelty to pass without touching it. He did not like the shape of himself that had set this in motion. He spoke before he could calculate who would hear and how it would cost him. "Leave it," he said lightly to a man who had intercepted him with a fresh anecdote, and did not stay to be sure the man obeyed. He crossed the floor with a pace that read as ease and arrived at the sideboard as the maid set down her tray to steady her hand. He reached past her and took the nearest glass, cool water, not wine, and set it deliberately on the tray she had just stabilized. A tiny, ordinary act. It altered the scene's balance without trumpeting its purpose. "Take this to the lady by the pillar," he said, voice low enough to be heard by her and by those nearest without giving the room a gift. "She looks faint." The lady by the pillar did not look faint. She held herself like a person who enjoyed watching men dispatch others for her comfort. The instruction was nonetheless unassailable. It made the maid's next steps clear. It turned her from target into function on the prince's word without making her his shield. She lifted the tray again, her fingers steady now, not because he had told them to be, but because the task was clean. "Yes, Your Highness," she said, eyes level with the line of his cravat, not his face. He gave the faintest nod and turned, intercepting the gentleman who had bristled, and now found himself obliged to lower his bristle before it became laughter. "Tell me the thing you were so eager to share," he said amiably, while ensuring the man's body shifted to give the maid room to pass. The gentleman's words dried to a trickle and then revived sluggishly on another topic entirely. The maid crossed to the pillar, set the glass before the lady with a bow that could not be faulted, and stepped back at once, denying the woman the pleasure of making her wait for a dismissive glance. She rejoined the servant's current along the wall and let the room swallow her again. He watched long enough to be sure the small storm he had diverted would not gather elsewhere, and returned to the center where the hosts wanted him. They wanted him always. They wanted him most when they had been made to realize that wanting might be complicated. "Your Highness," the host said with a gratitude that smelled faintly of fear. "What charm! None could have managed that better." "It required nothing," he said. "It had required seeing and a refusal to let a thing stand simply because it pleased others." He did not say that aloud. He smiled. The smile would be repeated at breakfast by people who would not remember the glass of water. He moved through greetings that drifted back to the earlier insult, as if touching a bruise to see if it still hurt. The woman who had spoken the cutting words had gathered admirers. She sat with her head high, proud of her accuracy in hitting the softest target. He met her eyes once across a gap and let his gaze pass through her. It was not a rebuke, it was absence. She did not like it. She laughed a little too loudly at something someone said. The band changed tempo again. The leader in the gallery glanced down. The house's rhythm had returned, if not its innocence. A footman approached the maid with a tray of fresh glasses for the supper that would be carried in on soft feet. She took the tray and adjusted her hold, careful of the slope of the hallway where spills were born. Her mind moved in two compartments now, the one that tracked work and the one that held the words, "When I speak, the past comes with me," like a weight wrapped in cloth. She passed a doorway and felt cold air brush the space between her shoulder blades, where the fabric sat too thin after a long evening. She did not shiver. She could not afford such weather on her skin. At the end of the room, near the long windows, she bent to set a glass and rose to find herself within arm's reach of a small cluster of men whose conversation paused to take stock of her proximity. "Precisely my point," one of them murmured, not bothering to lower his voice. "It makes sport of the thing." His companion smirked at his boots. He stepped in before a second companion could add the comment that hung between his teeth. "You will forgive me," he said to the small cluster with the kind of mock apology that smooths over recklessness when wielded by a lesser man. "You mistake sport for art. It happens to the best of us." One of the men stiffened, offended, and unsure how to lodge the complaint without stepping into a sharper point. The prince tilted his head and smiled, as if they had made the clever remark. The men allowed themselves to be disarmed. The maid set the glass with perfect placement and withdrew. He could not do this for every small sting. He could not be everywhere. He told himself as much, and felt the statement fail to absolve him. He made the rounds, offered a word to the leader in the gallery that made the man's shoulders settle, stood for the required number of compliments and petitions without dropping any of them on the floor. She returned the empty tray to the side table and reached for another. Her hands no longer shook. They had not forgotten the threat. They had decided to work anyway. She was bending to resettle a stack of plates when the prince's shadow moved into the corner of her eye. "Walk with me," he said quietly, not as a command, not as an invitation a gentleman extends to a lady, but as a practical phrase that could belong to any two people who had work to do. His timing was exact. He spoke at the moment a footman arrived to take the tray from her hands. The footman accepted it without comment and turned away. She hesitated just long enough to measure cost and cover. The band began a new strain that asked for the room's attention, and the room obliged. They stepped into the narrow passage behind the pillar where the sound softened and the faces around them turned toward the center. "I heard," he said before she could decide how to stand. "Not all of it." "What did you hear?" "That someone believes a story about you would travel well." She kept her breath steady. People prefer a story they can dress themselves. It did not sound like invention. It did not begin as one. She allowed the admission and nothing else. Her eyes stayed on the space just beside his shoulder. I cannot afford to have it told for me. He understood there was a door she would not open. He did not press it with questions that would own the space and show his ignorance as concern. He chose another angle. If I speak, I worsen it. You will make it bright, she said. They will see it better. And if I say nothing, you will not harm me. The simplicity of it humbled him. He did not say so. Then what would you have me do? See, she said softly. I do. Then leave me unseen. I do not yet know how. It is not difficult, she said, and then looked up at him fully for the first time since the music began again. Do not laugh. He exhaled as if he had been holding a weight he had only just identified. I will not. The promise was not grand. It sat within reach of his power. It bound him more tightly than he expected. The way you dance, he said, the words slow, because he was measuring them against the house's listening walls. It was not accident. No. Who taught you? He heard the danger in the question, even as he asked it. She let her hands find each other and rest, fingers laced where his eye could not read their tension. Once, she said, it was ordinary to expect more of my days than this. There was a time when I was told to carry myself as if the world would not press me flat. That time passed. I am still carrying. He let the answer stand. It was generous for its size. He felt the ghost of an old room stirring around her words, caught no names, saw no faces, and accepted the absence as part of her dignity. Pressing would have given him pieces he could not protect. From the gallery, the leader raised his bow and cut silence with brightness. The floor filled again. The hosts directed servants with nods that became a tide. Someone near the far wall called for the supper trays to be brought in a procession. She turned her head toward the sound, ready to resume the work that would shield her better than any promise. Wait, he said, a hand half lifted and then lowered because he would not touch. Do not refuse me this one thing. What thing? Allow me to be useful without putting a torch to the room. How? He glanced toward the woman who had mocked, and then toward the cluster of men who had tried and failed to turn their envy into wit. He chose the smaller fire. He stepped back into the light, as if the pillar had released him and crossed to the cluster, arriving in the pause between two weak jokes. You owe me a favor, he said, genial, to the one who had nearly backed into the maid. The man blinked and then smiled because the prince had arranged it to be so. You will discharge it by admiring what you cannot do. What is that? The man said, eager to agree. He turned his head toward the floor, where a pair had attempted the new step and come to grief without knowing it. That, he said. Watch how not to. Laughter followed, wrong-footed, pointed elsewhere. The men looked toward the dancers and away from service. The moment passed without needing to explain itself. He returned to the pillar and found her eyes had softened by a degree that would not register to anyone else. You will make enemies, she said. I was born with them. They expect better company than this. He nodded toward the mocking lady. They will be disappointed. Supper arrived in a shining river borne by arms that had learned how to bear weight without showing strain. The room changed tone, grateful for the new shape of pleasure. People moved to tables arranged at the edges. The center cleared and then filled again with servants moving in lines that seemed casual and were exact. She joined those lines. The work drew her tight into its pattern, and that was good. It left less space for the man's threat to sit upright in her thoughts. She set plates, removed empties, refilled glasses, and kept her eyes on tasks that, if done well, made her disappear. He watched without imposing himself. When one of the ladies at a table near the window made a remark plainly designed to be heard by the servant setting down the platter before her, he did not rebuke. He praised the platter with a comment so precise and so warm that it could not be interpreted as anything but offense to those who had chosen cruelty. The lady adjusted her mouth into an agreeable shape and held it there until it hurt. At the end of a path between tables, where the wall made a shallow recess that hid two bodies from the direct gaze of the room, she paused to adjust the cloth on her tray. He arrived there a moment later with the timing of a man who has spent his life stepping into places at the right moment and pretending it was chance. "You have not eaten," he said. "I am not hungry." "You are. It costs nothing to admit it to me. It costs me my place to accept it from you." He made no argument. He set a small roll wrapped in a napkin on the tray without touching anything else on it. She looked at the roll as if it were a coin she had no right to spend, and then picked it up with her left hand, because the right was needed for balance. She did not eat. She tucked it under the cloth for later, for when later came and the corridor was empty, and the ewer would have sweated away its chill, and she would need something to anchor the body that had carried her through the evening. "Thank you," she said. "For what?" "For seeing." He did not answer with a phrase that would cheapen it. He stepped back into the light again, and the recess swallowed enough of their exchange to make it unsaid if anyone wished to pretend they had not noticed. The band took a breath. The leader looked to the hosts and received a nod that said the night would ease down soon. The house was warm with satisfaction and argument. It would retreat into comfortable repetition if allowed. On the floor, the last dance before the long softening began. A circle formed and broke and formed again. People gathered themselves into shapes that made departing easier. He stood where he could see the room as a whole, and the narrow passage behind the pillar. He let himself measure the length of the evening against what he had done and left undone. He had not corrected the jest. He had not exposed the man in the corridor. He had not asked questions that would reduce her to an answer. He had chosen small uses and silence. It felt insufficient and precisely right. She carried the last tray to the sideboard and set it down, her fingers leaving no print on the polished edge. She turned toward the corridor because that was where the empties would be stacked, and the footmen would shoulder the weight that would make their backs ache later. She moved with the smoothness of someone who had survived a fall without appearing to fall at all. As she reached the shadowed doorway, the draught lifted again, a cool ribbon in the heat, and she paused, not to rest, but to mark the boundary she was crossing. The ballroom at her back hummed with appetite and opinion. The corridor ahead smelled of night air and work. She stepped through, and the music followed her just far enough to let the beat lay itself under her skin, like a promise that did not need to be spoken. The corridor breathed out as she entered it, a thin ribbon of night air curling along the baseboards and up into the sleeves she had rolled back a fraction for work. The music did not follow far, only enough to lay its beat under the stone and keep her steps in time. She balanced the empties with one hand and steadied the stack with the other. The draught lifted the loose hair at her temple and set it down again. The small shock of cool on hot skin sharpened her thoughts. Voices from the ballroom reached her in softened shapes, laughter, then the steadying murmur that follows it. The footmen at the far end were arranging a clean column of plates. Their hands moved with the practiced discretion of men who could carry noise in their arms and make it look like silence. She joined the current without looking up, because looking up invited conversation she could not afford. The tray settled onto the table. Glass kissed glass. The note was crisp and brief. Her hands wanted to be empty. Empty hands spoke of choosing, and choosing would be noticed. She reached for the next stack. A drop of water cooled the inside of her wrist where a jug had sweated. She took that small mercy without ceremony. It would have to serve. She did not think of the word the man had left like a stone inside the night. Past. She thought of the next table, the next rotation, the path that would keep her out of the way of a gentleman who habitually stepped back, as if chairs should move for him. She thought of the count of her breath. She kept to the rule that had held her upright all evening: do the next right thing, and let noise burn itself out for lack of fuel. She stepped from stone to wood. Heat rose to meet her. The chandeliers swam in their own light. The band lifted into a tune that promised ease after spectacle. People smiled into their wine. The cruelest faces were enjoying their satisfaction too much to sharpen it further. Good. The hour would begin to soften. The room would open its grip and release them to the night. She took the far line along the wall, the one that kept her out of the mirrors. The sideboard nearest the window had emptied. She refilled it with glasses, each set with the same pressure, each placed where a hand would expect to find it without knocking a neighbor. She could feel the sweat along her spine cooling against the linen. She welcomed it. It meant the air had begun to move. When she lifted her head a fraction to check the space, she found him across the room. He had returned to the center not the way a magnet takes back iron, but the way a man returns to a promise he did not intend to make and knows he must keep. The circle that habitually congealed around him held itself at a respectful distance, as if the faces had felt something shift and were waiting to see where to pin their expression. He breathed once, twice. The noise of the room rode up and then down like a tide finding a tide pool to fill. He was not counting plaudits now. He was counting cost. He had been born into rooms that made everything seem easy. This one made him honest. He had hoped that silence and small uses would be enough to right the thing he had tipped. They had steadied her, and that was no small work. It was not complete. He did not think of obligation as a trap. He thought of it as a compass. It swung now. It pointed directly at the very center he had filled so easily with jest and avoided with truth. He reached for it, the way a hand reaches for a banister in a stairwell grown dim. He lifted a hand to the gallery. The leader lowered his bow head in answer and let the phrase he had been about to command die in the air. The players stilled, the notes left hanging like bright silk that has been cut and must be caught. Conversations wilted at the edges. Fans stopped. Chairs stilled. The house listened because this was its habit when the prince made it. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. "Forgive me," he said to the room and the noise it preferred. The apology slid through ornament and found wood. It settled. "I made a promise in jest. It will not remain one." A laugh attempted to rise from somewhere near the pillar and failed, caught in a throat that found itself suddenly disloyal to its owner. He let it die. He looked toward the band again and then away, because the next note belonged to him. He crossed the floor. The path he walked was the same one he had walked 100 times for compliments and petitions. It felt new. His steps were quiet. He could have chosen any bright face turned up like a flower. He did not. She was setting the last glass on the far board when he stopped in front of her. The nearest conversations broke apart as if someone had put a hand into a flock of doves and opened it again. Silence collected around them with the speed of a rumor made flesh. The band held its breath. The candles did not gutter. They watched. He did not pretend not to see the tray, the plain sleeve, the clean edge of the cuff that had been turned twice to hide a worn seam. He did not stand too close. He stood at the distance where the first words of a waltz could be spoken without turning them into command. "If you dance this waltz," he said plainly, voice carrying because he gave it weight and not because he made it loud, "I will marry you." The words did not fall like a stone this time. They landed like a seal pressed in warm wax. The hall felt the impression and waited to see if it would hold. She did not reach for his hand. She did not drop the tray. She let the sentence enter her and sit. This was the moment where humiliation had been born earlier in the night. This was the moment where it would either be cleansed by truth or soured by repetition. The room had waited all evening for something to fix its story around. It had found it. She allowed herself one breath, deep enough to taste the roses and the varnish, and the small cold trickle that found its way along the floor from the propped door. "You are certain," she said, only for him, because certainty offered in public is sometimes only bravery in private. "Yes," he said. The word did not swagger. It stood. "And you understand," she said, "what you are asking of me." "I do," he answered. And because he was what he was, he understood only part of it. He let the rest show on his face. He let her see that he knew he did not know. She looked past his shoulder once, briefly, at the crowd that had made her into a story against her will, and then back at him, at the person who had begun that story and was now putting his name into it as more than author. "Then you will ask me," she said quietly. He did not flinch. He bowed, as a man bows to a woman he intends to honor, not as a prince takes possession of property to the approval of a room. "Will you dance this waltz with me?" he asked. She set the tray on the sideboard. Her hands were steady. She let them be seen. She uncurled her fingers from the empty work and placed them where the dance demanded. "Yes," she said. Air rushed through the room as if a window had been opened. It carried relief and outrage and something like awe. The band did not wait for instruction this time. The leader brought his bow down with a clean, decisive stroke that sent the first chord through the spine of the house. The measure gathered under their feet. It was the same waltz, and not the same at all. He extended his hand. She gave him hers. The heat of that contact ran a line from palm to shoulder and molten stillness to breath. His other hand found the formal place at her waist. It did not press. It promised. Her free hand settled at his shoulder with the assurance of someone who had chosen the act. They stepped. The room leaned in. The first turn took them out of the shadow of the sideboard and into full light. They met the light with open faces. He led, and he did not strain to do it. He made space. She entered it and made it wider without breaking it. The circle grew and tightened by turns, the floor sliding under them with the willing gleam of a stage that knows it is bearing something it will remember. A murmur began along the wall, the kind that gathers when people recognize that they must change their minds or be ridiculous. Some did not change them. Their mouths hardened to keep shape. Others let surprise soften. The difference marked itself without words. "Do not look at them," he said, the words a breath against measure. "I am not," she answered. He believed her. He did not think about his own face now. He thought about not failing her, which was the clearest thought he'd had all night. The turn took them past the mirror. Their reflection arrived with them, unadorned by flattery. He saw a man without his coat of jokes, and a woman who had refused humiliation, and become more visible by refusing him earlier and accepting him now. He kept his gaze trained on the space where the next step must fall. She matched him with a steadiness that gave the room nothing to catch but grace. The leader in the gallery felt the lift in his bones and gave the violin a sweetness he would remember later as a private pride. The drum spoke in the soft, taut syllables that keep breath from going astray. The flautist dared an ornament and was rewarded with a turn beneath it so clean that the note seemed made for their feet. They passed the pillar where a woman had sharpened her voice earlier and found the voice bladeless now. The woman's fan moved more quickly than necessary. Her cheeks had pinked beyond fashion. Her circle still laughed, but it was a different laughter, forced to mimic a pleasure it did not feel in order to avoid feeling what it would not name. "Do you regret this?" he said, low, at the turn that required no decision. "No," she said, and then, after a breath because truth benefited from exactness, "Not for myself." "For whom then?" "For you." He felt the honesty land in him and steady his step rather than shake it. "I have done worse for less," he said, and it was as close as he could come to saying that the cost, whatever it was, had already been paid when he let another person carry his joke. They turned along the long axis of the room. The host stood at the head, hands joined not for prayer, but for composure. The host's mouth found a smile that had not yet been taught. The hostess watched with eyes that measured risk with duty and found herself reluctantly admiring exactness. When the pair came abreast of them, he bowed without breaking the dance. They returned the acknowledgement because the room needed order to crown the moment, and people like them knew how to provide a crown when they were asked. He drew her into a closer circle. The hand at her waist warmed through cloth to skin. Her breath caught and fell back into time. There was no coyness in the contact, only the rightness of it. The waltz insisted on trust. She gave it, not as tribute, but as collaboration. He received it with the humility of a man who had learned the price of presuming. Someone at the far end began to clap, tentative, as if applauding would absolve them of everything that had preceded it. The sound was not yet a tide. It threatened to be ridiculous. The host lifted his chin a fraction, and the band, understanding, lengthened the phrase and drew attention back to music rather than noise. The claps died of embarrassment. Good. The declaration should be carried by melody, not by a scramble to be on the correct side of history. She let herself feel the floor under her as a partner. The floor had saved her earlier when people had sharpened their pleasure against her. It saved her now by holding them both evenly and making the movements inevitable rather than ornate. She could sense each plank's give, the varnish's slickness, the slight tilt near the north edge that had to be adjusted for with an extra fraction of weight. Knowledge like that was love of a kind. It anchored her when the air went too bright. "Look at me," he said, not as demand, but as shelter. She did. The house narrowed to a column of space between them that moved with them. In that column there was no laughter. There was only the breath they shared, and the way the next step always arrived just in time and never earlier. They came into the final passage. The melody lifted its head. The leader allowed it a small, golden length, the way you let a child run ahead to the gate, knowing you will catch her before she falls. He poised them with a pressure that asked, not told. She answered with a turn that would let them finish in the very place on the floor where she had begun the first dance that had threatened to make an end of her. He recognized the choice and followed it. That small act of following became a statement. The room understood. Agreement moved through the crowd in a shiver. The cruelest faces arranged themselves into something more complicated. They could not change their nature in an hour. They could, for a moment, be made to reconsider what it cost to feed it. The last notes came down like the cleanest snow, quiet, discreet, without the vaunt of a storm, and rested on the surfaces of things without soaking in. At the final count, he did not let go of her hand. He turned her into stillness and bowed, not deep as supplication and not shallow as mockery. Exactly right. When he rose, he addressed the room without releasing her. "I spoke foolishly earlier," he said, voice traveling to the corners without bruising the air. "I will not defend it. I will only say that what followed was true. You have seen it. So have I." No one laughed. A chair creaked and then hushed itself. The band stood with bows lowered. He looked to the hosts, not as if asking permission, but as if including them. "I hope you will forgive the theft of your evening's center. I will not return it in the condition I found it." The hostess's mouth, which had held itself along duty's line all night, softened. The host inclined his head. "Your Highness," he said, using the smallest number of words possible. "We are witnesses." It was the right answer. It neither claimed nor denied. It put the responsibility where it belonged, on the man who had made a jest and now made it a promise. He looked back at her hand in his. The ring finger bore no mark. He had not thought beyond this moment, and for once that did not feel like improvidence. He lifted her hand until the back of her knuckles caught the light. He did not kiss it. He pressed his lips to the air above it, old court courtesy held in modern hands, and then lowered it into his, where it stayed. "Will you believe me?" he said, low, for her, while holding the room with the mere fact of his posture. "Not my words only, but this." "I will believe what you do," she answered. "I am doing it," he said, simple as a man casts off a weight and breathes more easily for it. She drew a breath that ran through her like warmth. It was not victory so much as relief tasting of roses and wax and the salt of a long night shouldered well. Applause began, uncertain again, then stronger when it found it could be sincere rather than fashionable. It did not break like thunder. It rose like rain that has chosen a field and will make something grow there whether the field deserves it or not. The faces altered. People stood. A woman who had been cruel drew her shoulders in and became smaller in her chair. Men who had made remarks forgot them. The band raised their bows and held them in salute as much as readiness. He turned to the leader and nodded once. The leader understood. He lifted his bow, and instead of plunging into something quick to erase the charged air, he chose a simple waltz, not the new one, not the daring one, but a melody so clean it had no edges. It made children's feet remember their mothers' kitchens. It made old men straighten their backs without thinking. It made this moment belong as much to the servants as to the silk. "Again?" he said to her, not with triumph but with gratitude. "Again," she said. They took the first steps of a second waltz, quieter, closer, less for the room and more for themselves within it. He kept her hand and would not let the space fill with words. She gave him the turn and the look and the breath that said, "The wall has been climbed without you owning the climb." He met it with the steadiness that said, "I have learned to stand on the right side of my own folly." Around them, the servants moved with the unremarked grace of people who have always known how to make space for joy without stepping on it. Someone righted a chair. Someone closed a window by 2 inches to still a draft that had chilled a lady's nape. The night brought its own transitions forward as if to say, "I will carry this moment safely into morning without bruising it." When the tune ended, they did not wait for applause. He lifted her hand, turned her out and in, and let the last step place them where the evening had begun to change her life. He held her there and faced the room with her, as if to say, "This is ours, and you may look." She looked once up into his face, not to ask and not to doubt, but to learn it as it was when stripped of audience. What she saw steadied the small tremor she had kept at her wrist since the first jest. He saw in her what he had not earned and wanted, and for once wanting did not mean taking. It meant making a place. Silence did not fall again. It moved gently aside to let voices resume, altered. A current of approval found its own level. Skeptics preserved their dignity by praising the band. The house exhaled. Heat settled back on skin. The roses, which had been bruised by attention, relaxed their petals into sweetness again. He bent his head, close enough for breath and not for spectacle. "We will not feed them," he murmured. "No," she said, and then added, with the courage of someone who has learned that truth does not always draw blood, "And we will not starve." They stood for a heartbeat more, and then stepped apart on purpose, not because the room demanded it. He turned to the nearest gentleman who had looked most ready to sneer and gave him a task, arranged the thanks to the band, in a tone that sounded like honor and felt like discipline. The man bowed, flattered to be useful, confused to be forgiven. He moved at once. She crossed to the sideboard as if reclaiming it, lifted a glass of water, and met the hostess's eye. The older woman tipped her head the smallest degree in a gesture that neither apologized nor congratulated, and somehow did both. The maid drank, and the water tasted like the first sensible thing of the night. The leader lowered his bow and rubbed the heel of his hand along his wrist in a motion he would feel in the morning and be proud of. He looked down at the pair and saw not the scandal he had expected to report to his wife, but a steadiness he would try to translate into music the next time a hall demanded it. He returned to her, not to claim, but to stand. People approached in little knots, bringing politeness that could be mistaken for blessing. He let them. He let their words soften the edges of the story they would carry away from this room. He did not try to fix their minds. He did not need to. The visible thing had been done. The rest would follow, or it would not. He had chosen his side. "Will you rest?" he asked her when a pocket of quiet opened. "I will work," she said, and smiled, small and entire. "And then I will rest." He inclined his head, accepting her order of operations. "Then I will wait." "For what?" "For the next waltz," he said, as if the whole of his life could be organized around the truth that had turned a house full of hunger into witnesses. "And for whatever must be done between now and then." She let that be answer enough. She took up a tray, not because anyone had asked, but because it pleased her to choose something in a room that had tried to choose her. He watched her go and did not follow. He did not need to. The distance now meant something other than hierarchy. It meant trust. The night moved on. Candles shortened. Wax gathered like white pools on gilt saucers. The doors near the garden felt the cool edge of midnight and did not let it in. People stood, stretched, made the small noises that mean departure has begun to think itself possible. The hosts found relief and pride sharing the same breath. The footmen looked at one another in the way of men who have spent a battle together and intend never to mention it. He remained until remaining would turn into vanity, and then withdrew without taking light with him. As he passed the pillar, he looked toward the corridor where the draft lived and saw only the shadow of a tray on stone, the shape of work that made dignity possible. He smiled at it as if at an old ally. She felt him pass. The current in the room altered, and her skin, attentively tuned, read the change. She did not turn. She finished the thing in her hand, and the next, and then she allowed herself to lean once, briefly, against cool wood, not for support, but for the simple pleasure of knowing it would be there when she needed it. When at last the band lifted their bows for the final bow, and the house returned the gesture with a murmur that would be repeated in telling, she looked to the center of the floor where the circle had begun and ended, and placed her palm, light, against her own heartbeat, as if to mark it in that spot for the morning. Thank you so much for listening to this story all the way to the end. We hope it moved you as much as it moved us while telling it. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave us a comment telling us where you're listening from and what you like the most. Rate this story from 0 to 10. What score would you give it? If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave a like as a show of support. That really motivates us to keep creating and sharing more stories full of emotion and life lessons. And before we go, we want to remind you that an exciting and heartwarming story recommendation will appear on the final screen. If you'd like to enjoy it, just click on the video. Thank you once again for being here, and we'll see you in the next story.